When Rochelle's friends told her they would do anything she wanted for her 20th birthday, they already knew what she would say. She wanted to explore the graveyard at night. Not just any cemetery, but a special cemetery that she was drawn to every year. She couldn't explain her fascination with it. It had just been a place she had to go to for her celebration of birth each year. Unbeknownst to the young adult, this birthday would reveal the truth of her past and her future within the gates of the Spring Grove Cemetery. Rochelle wasn't brought up in a traditional post-Civil War American family. She had been orphaned, abandoned as a baby near the end of the war. Godfrey and Adelaide Berglisher had invited 2 new members of their church along with their newborn daughter over for dinner as a kind of welcome. When the Berglishers were in the kitchen preparing the meal, the couple slipped away into the night, leaving their daughter sleeping in the host's living room. When the Berglishers and the authorities were unable to locate the couple, they took it upon themselves to adopt the child into their own home. At least that was the story they told Rochelle. Rochelle never felt the bond with her adoptive parents. They loved her and cared for her, and she loved them, but they let her be free. They took good care of her, but kept their distance to a degree. They said her abundance of freedom was because they didn't really have to worry about her. She could handle any trouble that came her way. A year younger than Rochelle was their biological son, Angus. They didn't keep him at a distance, though. He was loved, protected, and even spoiled. Rochelle didn't hold any resentment. She enjoyed the freedoms that came with her status in the family. She also didn't really have any ambition to find her birth parents. They abandoned her. They were dead to Rochelle for all she cared. Rochelle wasn't an uncaring person, but her friends often commented on how she seemed stoic at times. But they loved that about her, most of the time. Rochelle also never really got along with other females. She didn't dislike them, they just never really clicked with her. Just something about her wasn't like them at all. If they were the popular girls, they cared too much about appearance. If they were the unpopular girls, they also cared too much about appearance and trying to impress the popular girls. Rochelle didn't care to make herself known by what she wore. Her homemade dresses were more her style anyway. She had a beauty that radiated on its own. Long, straight, dark hair, which she kept in a bun, so dark there was almost no variance in the color. Porcelain white skin and deep dark eyes. The young men would often give Rochelle notice, but she never had any feelings of being attracted to anyone. She wasn't disgusted by the idea, she just had no interest in dating. Even though Rochelle was beautiful in her own way, she was never arrogant about it. That's why her 2 male friends were a perfect fit for her. Gabe and Mike never thought of Rochelle as anything other than a friend, and they were the best friends she could have. While she floated through life uncaring about what the future would hold for her, the 2 boys would tell her she would unlock her true path one day. But Rochelle just played it off as friends being, friendly, doing and saying what they were supposed to. It wasn't a bad thing. She just took it with a grain of salt. They were good guys, but they could be a bit unnerving with their whole cryptic idea that Rochelle was the center of their little group. But she would never tell them that. She would rarely tell them anything about what was going on in her head. But they all felt like they belonged together, a perfect trio. The year prior, Rochelle told the boys she wanted to go to the Spring Grove Cemetery to walk around looking at all the Gothic Revival architecture and monuments encased within its fences. This was no surprise. She had been doing this for the last 3 years on her birthday. Some people would probably get bored with the idea of doing the same thing over and over, but Gabe and Mike became increasingly excited each year, an excitement that was becoming harder and harder for them to contain. For the past 2 years, she had been drawn to a particular type of monument. Monuments with female statues watching over the deceased beneath their feet. Rochelle would find a few each time and stand and stare at them, sometimes sitting on the grass at their feet, with the moon being the only source of light illuminating these beautiful tributes to the dead. To enter the grounds was no easy task. Well, not for vandals who were in a clumsy hurry, but for the trio of friends, they had a routine. They also had rules. Don't disturb anything. This was a place of eternal rest, and who were they to disrupt that? But be respectful to the grounds and those forever memorialized within it. They were even careful not to leave footprints in the grass. On the night of Rochelle's 19th birthday, she had found a particular monument that seemed to hold her attention like no other. It was a statue of a woman kneeling in front of a chair. The chair had a cloth draped over the back, and the woman was obviously in mourning over whom she used to sit in that seat. Such emotion in the structure. The woman seemed as if she were frozen in time, as if at any moment she would just start moving from her frozen posture. Light, or lack thereof, can play tricks on the mind and eyes. With the cemetery dimly lit by the moonlight, Rochelle could even have sworn she saw the statue's eyes gaze up at her with a sadness that dug deep into Rochelle's heart. She felt the sadness and dread of this woman, but it couldn't be true. There's no way a statue can move. Rochelle wasn't used to feeling this kind of emotion. She didn't shy away from it, but it just never really came up. Even when she was told the story of her parents leaving her with the Burglishers, she didn't show much emotion. However, this statue staring her weeping brought tears to Rochelle's eyes. She looked down at the woman's stone-hemmed dress, then back up at the sorrow-filled gaze, and it was gone. Rochelle stared at the statue another 20 minutes or so before her trance was broken. That's it, she thought to herself. I'm losing my mind. Rochelle stood up and continued through the cemetery. Spring Grove was so big that in the years she had been going there, she had not seen every monument and structure. It was always a real treat to discover something new, each headstone and memorial different than the last, but she felt compelled to return to that woman. Gabe and Mike always followed at a distance behind Rochelle, pretending to be exploring on their own, but it was obvious that they were looking after her. As strong and capable as she may be, they had always displayed a subtle sense of duty to protecting their dear friend. Passing one sculpture after another, a pyramid, a sphinx, women and children protecting their loved ones in an eternal pose, she didn't even realize she had circled back to the woman on her knees. Gabe looked at Mike, and both gave one another a slight grin. Mike spoke up. You see that? She went back to it. Gabe replied in a soft voice, Yes, this is exciting. Both watched closely ahead as Rochelle knelt down in front of the statue again, almost as if she were in a trance. Staring at the woman's face, Rochelle quietly wished to see her move again. She was being careful not to let Gabe and Mike hear her, who she'd known all along had been discreetly following her, but she let the boys have their fun and pretended not to notice them. By this time, Gabe and Mike had had enough of staying distant. They walked casually up to her, each taking to opposite sides of their kneeling friend, and joined her in her position. For a moment, they just remained silent. The dimly lit air smelled of freshly cut grass and flowers left on monuments. The energy was peaceful, almost poetic. But the silence was broken by a faint sound coming from Rochelle. Was she crying? The boys leaned back and shot each other a glance behind Rochelle's back, one that showed excitement to the other, but they were careful not to disturb their friend, although it was too late for that. Rochelle turned her head from side to side. A teardrop on her cheek sparkled in the moonlight, reflecting the moon itself on her pale white cheek. Still, other than the tears, Rochelle showed no real emotion. Mike was always the outspoken one. What is it, Shelley? That was their nickname for her. No one else dared call her that. What's bothering you? She turned to look away from him and back at the statue. I don't know. Just a feeling I get from this. Never noticed it here before. Gabe looked up at her. It's a very peaceful image. The man below her feet must have really meant something to this woman. Rochelle stood up. It's just a statue. I'm ready to leave. A feeling came over the two boys, and they knew this wasn't going to be the year. They were patient, though. This was the closest they had come to finally putting an end to this cycle. This gave them hope. As they walked out, they passed another grave. Rochelle, walking ahead of them, didn't pay attention to it. Gabe and Mike almost missed it as they were focused on Rochelle. Her walk was quicker paced than normal, and she wanted to leave the cemetery earlier than she had in previous years. It wasn't cause for alarm, but it was notable. The grave had a single slab on it. Barely able to make it out, they were what looked like two footprints on flat stone, side by side, just a bit darker than the rest of the white marble. 2 twisting paths away in front of it stood the monument with the woman on the chair. Barely visible from their location, with his hands at his side, Gabe gestured a finger to the empty slab. Mike shot him a disapproving glance and quietly whispered, "She isn't ready yet." Rochelle heard the mumbling coming from behind her and stopped. With her back to the boys, gaining ground on her, Rochelle whispered, "I hear you. That means other people will hear you too." But she didn't really make out what Gabe had said. She just wanted to warn them to be quiet. And it worked. When the trio exited the cemetery, none of them talked. It was often this way. They didn't have to use a lot of words to understand what the others were feeling and thinking. Somehow it had always just been this way. Sure, they had conversations. They would cut up and even talked about their families. Well, it was usually Rochelle pressed into talking about hers. But they all understood each other without having to vocalize it most of the time. It was like they were synced up on a whole other level. So leaving the cemetery that night, no one had to say a word. The boys walked Rochelle the 2 miles back to her family's small home and said their goodbyes. She watched as Gabe and Mike disappeared into the night, opened the door, and entered her home. In the days following Rochelle's 19th birthday at Spring Grove Cemetery, she made it abundantly clear not to speak of that night ever again. Not that it needed to be said, she just felt as if she needed to put it out there in the open. And so, it was never mentioned between the 3 of them. That was fine with Gabe and Mike. They were patient young men and knew it was only going to be a matter of time anyway. And they had plenty of time. That's all they had, really. The year leading up to Rochelle's 20th birthday was different than previous years. There was this new unspoken thing between them, the side of Rochelle that she never let anyone see before. It embarrassed her to a small degree, but if anyone were to see this emotion, it had to be Gabe and Mike. She didn't try to be mysterious, and it was just a trait she carried around with her. It was never an intentional stoicism. It was just the way she was. Gabe and Mike knew this and loved their friend in spite of it. It gained her an odd reputation in high school, though. The silent kid who showed no emotion. The kind of person kids are told to look out for. But everyone knew she was harmless. It just made her unapproachable. So Gabe and Mike were her only friends. It had been that way since they were back in grade school. As odd as this year had felt to Rochelle, the boys hardly gave it a second thought, and it wasn't like their lives nor their actions changed drastically from it. They had done the things they all enjoyed together anyway, mostly going to parks and sitting in the grass, either reading, watching the sky, or commenting on how other groups of people interacted with each other. One time, Rochelle asked the boys if what they had was normal. Both shook their heads in confusion, and Mike spoke up. "Of course this isn't normal. We aren't normal. We don't need the constant affirmation that others seem to thrive on." Not that any of them thought of other people as bad, nor did they look down upon them. If anything, they empathized with other people. They could read people. They knew they had empty lives, and they tried to fill with objects or other people that could not fill them. If anything, they wanted to help them. But Gabe and Mike knew time was drawing nearer, and there was no time to help everyone. 3 days before Rochelle's 20th birthday, Mike asked her what she would like to do, knowing what her answer would be. Even though the previous year's visit to Spring Grove Cemetery had been a minor hiccup, the boys knew she wouldn't be able to pass up another visit. She had a full year to process what had happened. Inside, though, Rochelle wasn't so sure. That haunting statue really made an imprint on her. As much as she didn't want to see it again, there was another side of her that couldn't help being curious about it. But this was not something she would tell her two closest friends. They didn't need to know this, and they seemed to enjoy the cemetery as much as she did anyway, even though they weren't good at hiding the fact that they followed her around from a distance. Still, she was really excited to get back there, but even a bit nervous. The day of Rochelle's 20th birthday felt different than others. Her brother Angus was actually nice to her. He even handed her a card he made and gave her a hug. He told her that he never really got to tell her how much he appreciated her. Rochelle was always good to Angus. If she saw anyone trying to bully him, or if he had trouble in his love life in later years, she would swoop in to the rescue or carry his emotional weight for him. Even if a bit spoiled, Rochelle loved Angus, and her parents were acting equally strange. Where they had not bothered her about her whereabouts in the past, this time they asked her if she would be returning to the cemetery. She nodded her head and saw the adoptive couple smile and tear up a bit. They hugged her and told her they loved her and always trusted in her. This felt good. Rochelle didn't need the love and affection in the past. She always just knew they loved her. It didn't need to be spoken, or so she thought. She hugged them back and told them she loved them too, and they didn't understand how much they had meant to her. Putting themselves out to take care of someone else who wasn't their own was the biggest act of kindness anyone could display, and she meant it. For the first time, she actually felt like she needed this on this day. Rochelle spent the day with her family, showing another side of herself to them that they weren't used to. She even laughed at some of her father's jokes, some of them. Angus, who would usually say happy birthday and leave to go meet his girlfriend, stayed this time, spending a lot of time around his family. Rochelle noticed the change, but didn't say anything. She always let people be who they were and didn't point out irregularities in their behaviors. She just considered that maybe they were becoming someone different. Everyone evolves, and Angus was at that age where evolution was natural. Several hours later, a knock came at the door. A soft knock, but Rochelle had been listening for it. She slowly opened the heavy wooden door and saw Gabe and Mike standing there with smiles. "Happy birthday," they both said in unison with excited voices. Rochelle smiled. "Thank you, guys." When Rochelle's family approached to see the boys standing there, Angus's heart dropped. He wasn't ready for this night to end. "Hey guys, you want to come in for a few?" Angus blurted out. "No thank you, Angus. We'd like to get going," Mike answered. "Why the hurry? You have all night," Angus answered back a little sterner than he should have. Rochelle turned around and looked at her brother. She saw a tear in his eyes. "Angus, we can do this again tomorrow, okay?" As calm and sweet as she could be, Angus nodded his head and wiped away the tears. Rochelle walked through the door with a strange feeling. She looked back at her family and smiled. "Thank you." They all smiled, but it didn't seem like happy smiles at all. She felt sadness, pain. A heavy air filled the stairs to the doorway. "I'll see you in the morning," she called back to them. Rochelle, Gabe, and Mike walked down the 8 stairs that led to the sidewalk, barely visible from the street lamps. When they reached the sidewalk, Angus sprinted down the stairs to his sister. Holding back his tears, he held his closed hand out. "I forgot to give this to you. Happy birthday, sis." Rochelle opened his hand, and within it was a necklace with an ornate gold locket. She took the necklace and opened the locket. Inside was a picture of Rochelle on one side and Angus on the other. She looked at Angus, beginning to get teary-eyed herself. "This is beautiful. Thank you. I love you so much, little brother." Then she handed the locket back to him. "Would you put it on for me?" She held up her long black hair as Angus placed it gently around her neck from behind and clasped it. She turned around and Angus gave her the biggest hug she had ever had. "I love you, Shelley." This made her smile. "I'll see you in the morning. We'll do something fun together tomorrow, okay?" Angus nodded. "Yeah, okay." Angus turned and slowly walked back up the stairs to his house where his parents were waiting. At this moment, he let his emotions get the best of him. He silently burst into tears and hugged his mom. "I'm going to miss her." His mother held him tight against her as she and her husband watched the woman they raised disappear into the night. Angus dared not raise his head. He didn't want to remember his sister this way. His entire 19 years with her flashed before his eyes, and Angus began sobbing uncontrollably. The 2-mile walk to the cemetery was mostly in silence, but Rochelle noticed there was something different with Gabe and Mike. They were wearing nice clothes. Not that they dressed badly before, but they were like her and didn't give in to the social norms of materialism. Their black jackets seemed to put off a shine against the darkness. Not a glow, but more of a slight shimmer. As calm as she could maintain, Rochelle had to ask, "What the hell's going on? First my parents and Angus, now you two?" Gabe and Mike just smiled at her until Mike spoke up. "This is your special night. We wanted to look nice for you for a change." Rochelle squinted her eyes, trying to study them. She couldn't feel what they were thinking. Noticing this, Gabe cut in, "Any area of the cemetery you'd like to see in particular tonight?" Rochelle just shrugged. She had not really thought about it. There were areas she hadn't explored yet. She figured she would just go where the war mare carried her. The rest of the walk was spent in silence, and Rochelle felt the heavy air all around her. When they arrived at the decorative black steel gate to the Spring Grove Cemetery, Rochelle noticed the gate was open slightly, enough for her and the boys to squeeze through. Usually they had to sneak in over a fence or a wall or something. She felt a little more tense now. Seriously, what's going on? This is never open. The boys kept calm and Gabe answered, leaving out any alarming tone. "I know a guy, but he'll be by shortly to close it, so we have to hurry." He wasn't lying. He did know of a guy who was forgetful with the gate and would often leave it open by mistake. This just happened to be one of those nights. The friends took up their usual pattern. Rochelle in the front, about 20 paces ahead. It was a clear night, and the waning moon was brighter than should be possible. The monuments and the structures were lit up with brilliance. They almost seemed to glow. The deeper they trekked into the cemetery, the brighter the stone and brick structures seemed to become. Rochelle was making it a point to avoid the path leading to the woman in the chair, but she had never seen this place this bright. It was strange. The air around them was dark, but the structures were unusually bright in contrast. Once again, the smell of fresh-cut grass invaded their senses, and the freshly placed flowers were not offensive either. The air was warm, but there was a slight breeze. It was a perfect night. Rochelle was mindful of the path she was taking. She didn't want to come across that statue again. Secretly, she kind of did. But it was hard for her to remember exactly where it had been. It had been a year since she saw it and was in a hurry to get out of there the last time. She couldn't quite tell the paths from one another, though. Everything just looked different. Noting the monument's details in a way she had never noticed before, she lost track of where she was. One after another, everything just looked new to her. Excited and hurrying between them to get to the next one, she stopped dead in her tracks. There it was, right in front of her. She was sure she didn't take that path, so it confused her when she was face to face with the weeping woman. Back a ways, Gabe held his hand in front of Mike to stop him. He nodded in Rochelle's direction, and they both stood absolutely still. They watched as Rochelle collapsed to her knees at the feet of the woman weeping by the chair. Rochelle felt the freshly watered grass hit her knees as she slumped down in disbelief. She took a quick survey of the area and noticed how different the paths actually looked. Everything looked different. The monuments surrounding her darkened as a passing cloud blocked the moon, but this statue remained illuminated. Rochelle scooted closer on her knees. She could feel the emotion once again. It hit her and made her heart swell. She reached out with her hand and placed it on the woman's own hand. She looked into her eyes as the woman's own eyes raised to look at Rochelle. There were tears. The woman was crying. Was it just dew and her mind was playing tricks on her again? had to be. But the woman's eyes were locked on Rochelle's gaze. Rochelle burst into tears as she felt Gabe and Mike's hands on her shoulders, one on each side. Rochelle's only friends stood over her, keeping their hands gently on her shoulders. Then in perfect sync, they kneeled down beside her. With the softest tone that Rochelle could feel in her very core, Mike asked her, "Do you know who this woman is, Shelley?" Rochelle shook her head. "No, and I didn't want to see her again." Gabe, using the same soft tone, replied, "Shelley, this is your mother, and beneath her is your father." Rochelle sat upright in disbelief. She didn't speak. She just kept her eyes on the woman's teary eyes staring back at her. Deep down, she knew it to be true. Tears flowed more freely from the statue's face as her lips began a sort of smile. Rochelle could feel it. The smile, the tears, the sadness drifting away. Rochelle stayed on her knees, touching her mother's hand. For anyone else, this would seem crazy, but she understood that her father was below the grass, while her mother had been immortalized eternally in stone, forever saddened over the loss of her husband. Rochelle felt this too. She understood it. She began rationalizing, or rather, trying to understand more. With her free hand, Rochelle reached onto her shoulder and touched Mike's hand. "I don't belong out there, do I?" As she nodded her way to the way they came in, Mike answered, "No, this has always been your home." Rochelle let out her own tears. "Somehow I always knew it." Mike placed his other hand on top of Rochelle's. "I'm sorry, Rochelle. You died at birth in 1862. The memories you have with the Berglishers are real. We gave you another chance at life and placed you in the care of the Berglishers. It was Gabriel and I who took you to them almost 20 years ago, with the understanding that one day you would return here." Rochelle stood up abruptly. "Why not just give me back to my mother and father originally? Where am I then? Why wasn't I drawn to my own grave? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mike continued, "You had to learn this on your own, in your own time. Your mother and father knew you died at birth. We had to wait a couple of years before bringing you back." Gabriel interrupted. "Michael, I think we need to show her now." Gabriel nodded. As they turned to walk away from her mother, Rochelle spun around and bound for her mother, wrapping her arms around her, then touching her father's chair. This was a lot for her to take in, but she understood perfectly for some reason. It didn't help her sadness, though. She released the statue, her mother's eyes returning to their original fixed position. Rochelle stood up and slowly began following Gabriel and Michael down the path. She noticed it wasn't just their black jackets shimmering in the dim light. It was their full figures. The reality of who these two men were, who had been her friends for as long as she could remember, was giving Rochelle a sense of calm that she really didn't expect, not from something like this. With each monument she passed, the Spring Grove Cemetery took on a new meaning for her. She was no longer a visitor between these fences and walls. She was now a resident. As Rochelle slowly paced behind Gabriel and Michael, the eyes of the other statues seemed to follow her. She wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt welcomed home, peaceful, but still sad. Thoughts of how her adopted family will feel clouded her mind. She grasped the locket around her neck, thought dearly of her brother Angus, and pressed forward. Gabriel and Michael stopped in front of a marble slab. The clouds parted ways and the moon lit up the flat white slate. There on the plate were two dark spots where the feet of another statue should stand. Rochelle approached slowly, with her head slumped and her shoulders slouched. If she had known this moment was coming, she wished she had told herself to prepare for it. Rochelle came up from behind Gabriel and Michael, parting them as she stood between them. She saw the marks where her feet should go on the marble. Gabriel gestured to it with an open hand. "By sunrise, you will take your place here." He seemed different, a little more caring than he had been in the years leading up to this. Maybe it was resignation for the job he had to perform, or even resentment for having to do it. A tear came to his eye, rolling out onto his cheek. Rochelle wiped away his tears and threw her arms around him. She then turned to Michael, and he too was welling up. She wrapped her arms around him tightly. "It's okay." Then she released him and stepped onto the platform, placing her feet in the spots outlined for her. The next morning, when Rochelle didn't return home, the burglars knew what had happened. They had been warned almost 20 years prior that this was going to take place. Angus had been told about it as well, with the promise that he would never say anything to his sister. This was her path of discovery, and it wouldn't be fair to reveal it before her time. Angus remembered teasing her about being adopted, but never in a mean way. He knew one day he would lose his sister, and he didn't want anything mean-spirited between the two of them. Shortly after Rochelle's 19th birthday, Gabriel and Michael had visited the burglars when Rochelle was out. They told them that the day would be coming on her 20th birthday. The family thought they were prepared for it. They even distanced themselves a little further from her in the year leading up to it. But nothing could prepare them for the hole in their family that was left with losing their daughter and sister. Now another family had to feel the pain of losing Rochelle. Barely able to reconcile what had happened, the family sat at the kitchen table in silence. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. None of them had slept for more than a minute or two at a time. Faces drawn, unable to eat, they all just leaned on each other without saying a word. Suddenly, there was a light knock at the door. They knew this knock. All three jumped up from the table as Mr. Burglar opened the heavy wooden door. Standing before them were Gabriel and Michael. Angus tried desperately to peer around them, hoping to see his sister behind them, but she wasn't there. This visit was short, neither man stepping into the house. This was normal for them, and they often didn't go inside. It was a way of separating themselves from the job they had to do, keeping too much of her personal and family life away from their own emotions. This had been a problem for both of the archangels in the past. They told the burglars that everything was okay, that Rochelle had joined her mother and father. As prepared as the family tried to be for this moment, the reality of this news didn't hit them any softer. All three wept softly for their lost daughter and sister. The remainder of the visit was very brief, with only directions shared to the family of the events that transpired the night before. Gabriel and Michael then headed back down the stairs to the cobblestone street and vanished slowly before the burglars. An hour later, the gates to the Spring Grove Cemetery opened and the burglars already were waiting to go in. They walked in and began up the path, winding around from one path to the next. They realized they had never actually been inside this hallowed place. Passing one monument after another, they really didn't pay much attention to any of it, as beautiful as the place was, until they reached the plot that Gabriel and Michael had mapped out for them. Looking down at first at the marble slab to the tiny burial, big enough for just an infant, the name Rochelle Geist, pronounced carved into the stone. The date August 16th, 1862, the only other marking. Almost in perfect harmony, all three burglars raised their heads to see their beautiful daughter and sister immortalized in a brilliant white stone, looking just the way she did the moment she left their home the evening prior. Angus looked at his sister and noticed she was still wearing the locket he had given her for her birthday. It was open, and he could almost make out the pictures held within. Thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment. It really does help the channel. Until the next time, this is Story Time. Stay weird.